Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching. June was in full swing, and the first sunny days beckoned to leave Manila to be away from the bustle of the city. An expensive foreign car was driving along the sun-drenched highway, its open windows blasting incendiary music for tens of kilometers around. The Black Beauty was obviously worth a lot of money, which could hardly be earned by its young owner at the wheel of the car. A guy in his 20s was sitting imposingly on the back of the seat. In the cabin besides himself, there were two other passengers of about the same age. All three looked alike. Fancy haircuts, expensive clothes. It was telling that the guys had no limits on their money. The driver, having turned off the music, turned to his friends. "Well, boys, shall we have a good time? And while you're at it, see how my ancestors have once again bought such a mansion? That's awesome. My father said that the dacha will be on the shore of the lake. Yes, in this cottage can accommodate half of this village." He waved his hand out the window, toward the side, flashed to all on the side of the half-abandoned village. One of the comrades looked at his friend enthusiastically, as if he had bought the castle he was describing with his own money. Then he grinned and asked, "Simon, tell me, why do they need so much housing? After all, you have only 5 apartments. There's also that house in Spain, where we vacationed last year. Now this mansion on the lake, the heir to all this wealth, carelessly looked at his friend and replied, 'Well, what do you think you are out of the moon? Dad says real estate is always a good investment. And can you complain? It's not like you've got a 1-bedroom in the suburbs.'" He turned around, winked at the passenger in the back seat and continued, "You ain't poor yourself. Such a good business your families have, like ours, is known far beyond our immensity. Alexander will also get a whole fleet of cars. There's probably nowhere to put the cars. I see that your mother takes a different car every day to match the color of the outfit." On what Alexander brushed off and mouthed a little angrily, "Yes, she's already fed up with these cars." As they see which of her friend's new car, immediately to the father, he never refuses her. Says it's easier to buy than listen to her whine. "Come on." "It's not like I'm offended either." Fully staffed, Kevin said with irony in his voice. His friends were well aware that, thanks to his parents, Alexander had a posh 3-room apartment in the center and a nice car. And he studied at the institute only because his father paid. They talked about their parents' nonsense for another 5 minutes, and then the owner of the foreign car turned on the music again and started booing to the beat of a tune he knew. John, who was sitting in the back, was silently watching the scenery outside the window. He never once joined in the conversation. The boy had never participated in conversations about family and loved ones, especially not in that tone of voice. As much as they were, all 3 of them looked alike on the outside. At heart, John was very different from his friends. Whereas Kevin and Alexander were spoiled brats who got everything they wanted from childhood, John grew up in a very intelligent family. He didn't immediately become a well-to-do man. The guy's parents once started their lives after college as ordinary engineers. For the first 2 years after John was born, they lived in a small 1-room apartment on the outskirts of town, not far from the factory where his parents worked. But his father, being the best graduate of the institute, very quickly managed to set up his own business, and in a few years they moved into a large apartment in the center. And another year later, they had a cottage in the country, where they liked to go as a family on weekend. Unlike John's parents, who had to do everything themselves, his friends' families inherited the business from Kevin and Alexander's grandparents, who had started it and then passed it on to their children and grandchildren with all the wealth they had gained. Not that John could consider the boys his friends, but being at the same institute and his parents' friendship led to pure companionship and meetings like this. So this time, at Kevin's insistence, he agreed to a country trip. John decided that a vacation away from the hustle and bustle of the city by the lake would not be out of place, and he was used to letting his friends' idle chatter pass him by to the loud rhythms of some foreign tune. John was immersed in his thoughts. Suddenly Alexander literally shouted, "Guys, look at that sales girl. It's like a copy of a painting from the last century." Kevin immediately slowed down sharply and grinned, backed up his buddy just like some peasant girl. John looked in the direction Alexander was pointing. Right on the side of the road stood a frail girl in a long dress almost to the ground, as if found in her grandmother's trunk. A white shawl was neatly tied on her head, from under which a long braid fell on her shoulder. The girl was so thin that it seemed you could see her sharp shoulders, and her front sticking to the top of the leaves through the fabric of her clothes. In a small basket were bath brooms, clearly made by her hands. When she saw the foreign car stop, the girl raised her huge eyes, frightened, and shrank back somehow. The guys got out of the car, and the first to turn, either to her or to his friends, was Kevin. Look what a natural wonder. Bony as a woman. But the cashier is just like my grandmother was when she was young. Everyone still shows her pictures from those years. Do Baba Yaga walk with braids? He winked at his friends and laughed. And Alexander immediately, as if continuing his thoughts, said, "A Yaga with a scythe can only walk on a wooden stick or an iron one. But no, it's an old woman. Death walks around like that." They spoke as if the girl were not a living creature and could not hear or understand what they were talking about. Kevin later turned specifically to the girl and asked Riley, "You flew in on those lovelies you put up for sale, didn't you?" The boys, pleased with their wit, laughed. John looked at the poor stranger, who appeared so frightened and defenseless at that moment that the boy's heart squeezed. The poor woman's eyes filled with tears, and it was obvious she was about ready to burst. "Hey, leave the man alone," John decided to intercede. "He's peddling. So let him trade. Let's go. What's there to lose time for? No rest awaits. Somebody else promised a can." John tried to distract the boys and get them to the car as quickly as possible. There was something special about this girl that made her feel sorry and want to help. To John, even in spite of all the rustic attire, she seemed very even pretty. The simple, very refined features of her face, without the slightest bit of makeup, seemed somehow angelic. The only thing that didn't go well with that image were her sad eyes. John realized from the first minute that this petite and very young girl had not come to the highway with her goods for a good life. She evidently had a hard life in the middle of nowhere, obviously not in good health. While her friends were discussing something heatedly on their way to the foreign car, John quickly took some large bills from his inside pocket and silently put them into the basket with the brooms. The girl was standing off to the side at this moment, evidently out of excitement or fright, running her hands over the leaves of one of her wares. John quickly turned around and went to the car. His friends, already turning up some hit song at full volume, tried to shout out the music and called out to him. "What are you stuck in there for?" shouted Kevin in his hoarse bass. "Did that hillbilly witch put a spell on you? Let's go already." John didn't blink an eye and sat in the back seat, continuing to stare out the open window at the stranger, as if trying to memorize her features. They drove very quickly to the cottage village where Kevin, our parents' house, was located. Indeed, it looked like a castle. The two-story building marveled at the turrets and ornate finishes. The number of rooms, however, could accommodate the inhabitants of a small village. All the furniture in the house was expensive and, according to Kevin, handmade. The dishes and other furnishings had allegedly been brought from abroad. It was not surprising, because everyone knew that his parents were constantly traveling abroad on vacation or on business. The boys spent the evening having a lot of fun. To be more precise, only Kevin and Alexander were having fun. John was immersed in his own thoughts. The stranger on the road really had something on his mind. Her image did not leave his mind. John tried to keep up some conversations with his friends. Then he went for a steam bath, unlike his comrades, who were not very fond of the steam room. He just loved inhaling the hot air and could lie on the floor for hours. My parents' bathhouse was still under construction. His father had planned a big 2-story one with tennis and pool tables. But when he was free, John gladly accepted his neighbor Byron's invitations, and they could sit in the alley for hours, chatting on various topics. The retired officer who lived in the cottage on the right was a very sociable and intelligent man, and John liked to visit him. And John enjoyed sitting there for nearly an hour. Then they roasted kebabs and made cocktails. But John's thoughts kept returning to the brown eyes and the beautiful woman with the broom. Kevin and Alexander, the experimenters, were mixing something in their glasses, laughing. John, by virtue of being completely intolerant of alcohol, was drinking freshly squeezed juice. Kevin, always inviting John such picnics, laughed and said, "Well, a sober driver helps out his friends. Not without you. Somebody's got to get us home after we've had a hot one, right?" The friends took advantage of the fact that John couldn't say no, so they could afford to get pretty drunk. Kevin and Alexander, who were used to spending their time aimlessly at the computer or at a club, couldn't understand him at all. Nevertheless, the three of them talked a lot. On this trip, all John's thoughts were of the girl on the road. He couldn't forget her sad eyes. At night, he even dreamed of her quietly humming something, one song after another, folding the coils and tying their broom. The voice sounded simply mesmerizing, and that's despite the fact that she didn't say a word there on the road. On the way back to town, John looked forward to the place where he'd met her. He wanted at least one more glimpse of the beauty. But unfortunately for him, the road was empty. His mood immediately soured, and the only thing he was glad of was that both his rest-weary friends were asleep, and he could be in silence instead of listening to their silly chatter. When he returned home, life went on as usual. But John often remembered the stranger he had never met on the road, so that when he saw a man for just a few minutes, he could remember him all the time. Lana, with whom John was dating at the time, immediately noticed the change. And just a couple of days after his return from that trip, she asked John angrily, "What happened out of town? It's like you've grown cold to me. I can see you trying to make up excuses not to see me every time." John didn't know how to tell her that he was thinking all the time. Totally not about her. Lana was a wonderful, kind girl from a very well-off family. Their parents had been friends recently. They had introduced the children in the hope of marrying them. Their fathers jokingly talked about merging their businesses. John could not say that he was in love with Lana, but they did have fun together. The encounter with the stranger was as if it changed something in the guy himself. He suddenly realized that he had never thought about anyone like that before, day and night, realizing that he could not go on like this. He suggested that Lana take a short break from the relationship and not see each other for a while. John couldn't explain what he was hoping for by taking this time. But he knew for sure that he didn't want to see anyone else around for a while. Lana, of course, immediately told her parents about John's decision. They, in turn, told the boy's parents, and his mother began to tearfully plead, "Come to your senses, son. What happened there? Everything was so great. You're a perfect couple with Lana, and you're perfect for each other. What's gotten into you?" "Well, Lana, she's a beautiful girl. Smart, beautiful girl. Smart, beautiful, not some spoiled fifer." John listened in silence to her lamentations. His father suddenly said quietly but sternly, "All right, Mother, that's enough. Stay out of it." Changing his tone a little, he added with a smile, "Not everyone is as lucky as me with you." So straight from college and for life, he walked over to his wife, kissed her, and offered to close the subject. John looked at his father gratefully. He had always felt and understood his son, helped him get rid of the explanations. John went silently to his room and, shutting the door, went to the window. Behind the glass, the summer rain was bringing nothing but sad thoughts. Looking at the large, tear-like drops, he imagined the sad eyes of the stranger and was angry with himself for not being able to do anything about the fact that he constantly remembered her. The days for him had become somehow monotonous and uninteresting. Opening his favorite book, he did not understand what he was reading. Turning on a good old comedy, he could not even smile, let alone laugh at it, as recently, on one of those days, Kevin called him. "Hey, old man," in his usual chipper voice, Buddy started. "What are you up to?" Although let me guess, your mom told me when we met that you dumped Lana. So I guess now you're sadly remembering your affair. Although I can't figure out what the hottie did to you. Knowing why his friend usually called in the evening, John, trying to get ahead of the question, replied, "Listen, I'm definitely not going to be your sober driver tonight. I'm not in the mood at all. And I just asked Lana to give me some alone time, which I'd like to ask you to do." Kevin immediately muttered in a hurt voice, "Is that what you think of your friends? Believe me, I'm not always as self-serving as you think. And right now I don't need a sober driver at all. I just want to help a friend. I suggest that you come with us to the wedding of a famous banker. Our parents will be there, by the way. And trust me, you'll be able to forget all about your problems. The banker makes such cakes. This might be his third or fourth wedding, and I've been to 2 of them, and the table is full of people halfway across town. And what kind of wives does that prick choose? One is more beautiful than the other. Almost all from the provinces, though. That old man's a real party pooper. That's why only the quiet, unassuming simpletons can tolerate his antics." Kevin was a lover of telephone chit-chat, and at length described the charms of this lover of women's wives, adding in the end that the spouses themselves filed for divorce, forcing this lover of young girls in bed with their mistresses. Just what these wiretaps were counting on. "Let's go out for a while. If he doesn't like it, let's see what kind of fool he's found once again," Kevin said. John knew Kevin wasn't going to let it go. He thought about it and reluctantly agreed for a while. He didn't care who he married or what was on the tables at the best restaurant in town, but for some reason he really wanted to relax a little. For the sake of such a celebration, the restaurant, consisting of 2 floors and accommodating a huge number of people, was completely closed to outsiders. The guards at the entrance checked the invitation cards and only let people in if they had them. It seemed that the best and richest people of the city had gathered there that evening, though it seems it was not only them. Before the festivities began, waiters distributed imperatives among the guests, and over the knees of the women, on a huge table in the hall, was a pyramid of champagne glasses, and several other tables with magical snacks and fruit. Women in evening gowns and expensive jewelry were discussing something wildly. A few men in tuxes and suits were grouped together, talking excitedly. John, Kevin, and Alexander found a comfortable place and watched the arriving guests from a distance. Suddenly, a tall, gray-haired gentleman in a suit, whose lapel was decorated with what looked like a New York flower on his jacket, came up to the microphone on the small stage. "My dear guests," he began in a sweet voice, smiling, "I am very glad that all of you did not refuse to share with me today the joyful event in my life. Let me introduce you to my beautiful wife. I hope she is the one who will go hand in hand with me all my life and help me to find marital happiness. Anna, come here, my dear." He took a step toward the stairs leading to the stage and stretched out his hand in a picturesque manner into the hall. The moment the young wife who had been invited walked up to her spouse, John turned to them and his heart raced. Another second and the juice glass would have fallen out of his hands for sure. He could barely keep from rushing toward the stage. By the steps she was climbing, she was the same girl from the road in the white wedding dress. The stranger really looked like an angel now, only her eyes did not grow happier. It seemed to John that there was more pain and tears in them now. In the unusually beautiful, almost airy dress, she seemed as fragile as a porcelain statuette, and totally unbecoming, it seemed to John, of that wimpy old man. The lad was almost certain. The girl must have been persuaded by this prototypical Bluebeard for mountains of gold and prosperity. But she had no idea what could be expected of her in this marriage, and that she would not get an extra penny from this jerk. Immediately after the performance of the newlyweds, or rather her newlywed husband, the host invited everyone to come to the table. Joy appeared on the faces of the guests, as if that was the only reason they had come here. For the rest of the evening, John stared without noticing anything around him, keeping his eyes fixed on the side where the newlyweds were sitting. He wanted to rush across the room, grab Anna in his arms, and run as far away from here as possible. He was a complete stranger at this party. The groom was so engrossed in his drinking that he seemed to remember his own wedding only when they shouted bitter. Getting a moment as the banker withdrew to his friends, John quickly approached the bride. "What are you doing?" The young man began quietly in a trembling voice. "I'm sorry, but you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. He's taking advantage and throwing you out. It's all about the money. How much do you want? You are very aging. You can't live with him," he said. The girl smiled sadly as if apologizing and replied, "I recognized you. It was you who then on the road left me a large sum in the basket for which you could buy 100 of these brooms. But that is not enough for me. I have a very sick son." John was confused. Anna, it seemed to him, so pure innocent, and it turns out already with a child in his arms. At the same time, John realized that she must have just graduated from high school. She did not look more than 18. It was obvious that Anna had something else to say to him, looking straight into the eyes of the young man. It was as if she was looking for understanding and support. "I couldn't do otherwise," she continued quietly. "I need this marriage." Harry promised to help with the treatment after the wedding. She wanted to say something else, but then a rather tipsy spouse approached them, his face removed. The young wife was covered in droplets of sweat. Her eyes were no longer able to catch everything from the drink. Staggering, he approached John and through gritted teeth muttered something that pleased Maladushno. "Too late, brother. She's good. Not yours, though I am good today. I'll tell you where to find one. You get in your wheelbarrow at home. You have it in villages and villages. Only in the middle of nowhere can you find such pristine beauty." He put his arm around Anna's shoulders, and John could see the effort it took for her not to push her husband's hand away. She seemed to be doing her best not to tear herself away. She didn't seem to be enjoying herself at all. John turned abruptly and walked away to his table, where his companions were already enjoying themselves to the fullest. Kevin immediately winked, jokingly saying, "But John, I wasn't expecting you like this. What are you doing with another man's wife? That Bluebeard is mad when he finds out that he was not the one who cheated on his wife. At least you're the only one who did it, and with whom? Handsome athlete activist, the best student at the institute." He didn't get to finish. John glared angrily and sharply, almost shouted, "Shut up. You take a walk, but stay out of my way." Come on, mouthed the mate in surprise. What's the matter with you? Do you know the fiancée? By the way, I remember her face too. I know I've seen her somewhere." John, answering nothing, got up and headed for the exit. He didn't want to be at this lying party anymore, where everyone was smiling sweetly at each other while discussing everyone behind their backs. Already in the foyer of the first floor, Anna caught up with him and, putting some paper in his hand, whispered, "Call me, please. I'm begging you." Anna disappeared as quickly as she had appeared. John, opening his palm, saw a piece of tissue paper with a telephone number on it. His heart went off its normal rhythm again and began to beat frantically. He noticed that every time he remembered her, it was ready to pop. For a while, John stood at a loss, clutching the cherished scrap. He didn't know what to do with it next, but deciding that looking at it that day would be a torment for him, he went home. For several days, he hesitated to dial the number. He wasn't sure why she'd even given it to him. But a couple of days after that ill-fated wedding, he couldn't resist calling. After a few short beeps, there was a gentle voice on the other end of the line that made John dizzy. "Hello? I'm listening to you. Don't be silent. Speak." The voice sounded mesmerizing. Gathering his courage, John blurted out, "You gave me the phone. You asked me to call. I'm sorry. I didn't introduce myself. My name is John. I was at your wedding," the girl replied cheerfully. "Somehow I knew you would call. I've been waiting for this call. I really need to explain everything to you. They arranged to meet at a park on the shore of a small lake not far from downtown. John arrived first, and when Anna appeared, he didn't immediately recognize her in her sky blue suit and neatly styled hair. She did not look at all like the village stranger selling brooms by the roadside. The only thing that remained unchanged were the sad eyes. She was still without a drop of makeup, but that only made her face more beautiful. "Good afternoon," began the first Anna confusedly. "You'll forgive me for distracting you just after that meeting at my wedding. Now I suddenly felt like telling you everything so you wouldn't think I was self-serving, jumping out over a rich man for money." John offered her a seat on a nearby bench, and as they walked, he began to speak indignantly. "I don't think anything of the sort. It's just that you don't realize you're ruining your life. You won't be happy with that scoundrel. He's only used to use women. It'll be the same with you as it was with all his previous wives. And as far as I know, he's had quite a few. I don't know what he promised you, but I think it was nothing. He ain't the kind of man to throw his money around. Rumor has it he'd kill himself for a penny." She looked sadly at John, and with a sigh replied, "I don't care what happens next. My boy needs help now. That's why I put up with everything. I'm used to hard things. Wasn't there any other way?" John's own spiteful expression was unanticipated. There are relatives of some sort. Let them help after all. The boy must have a father somewhere. Let him help too. Anna looked at John for some time without looking away. With eyes full of tears, she began to tell him. And the boy at that moment was ready to listen to her ad infinitum, afraid to even move. She, lowering her eyes quietly, spoke. "I was born in the very village where you and I first met. Since childhood, my life was not easy. My mother worked from dawn to dusk on the farm, sometimes barely alive. She'd come home, and there was still a vegetable garden. Me and my brother and my always drunken stepfather. He never worked properly. Just something for a coven somewhere, and you'll drink it right away. You know what I dreamed of when I was a kid?" She smiled and looked at John, who only shook his head in confusion. She immediately continued, "Since the 5th grade, I dreamed that when I grew up, a prince would come and take me away from this nightmare far away. When I went to the math Olympiad in 10th grade in the district, that subject was my favorite. I met Tom there. He was from the neighboring village, where he lived with his parents in a big, beautiful house. I fell in love with him literally at first sight, and he surrounded me with attention and care. Tom began to come every free minute on his moped to my village. He gave me field flowers, called me his favorite. I seriously thought then that he was my prince. We dated for a year, made plans that as soon as I graduated from school, we would immediately go to the registry office. We even wanted to go to the same institute. But at some point, I began to feel as if Tom was avoiding meeting me. Every time he looked for some ridiculous excuse. And then a kind fellow villager told me that my Tom was getting ready to marry a farmer's daughter. The bride, unlike me, was enviable. Her father's farm was considered one of the largest in the neighborhood. Of course, I was no match for her. Tom wouldn't even explain himself to me. He just sent me a note saying, "I'm sorry that our relationship was a mistake." That's how my prince disappeared just as quickly as he appeared. She fell silent, and it seemed to John that the girl was trying to hold back tears. He took her hand in his and stroked it. Anna immediately raised her face sharply and looked at him gratefully. Without pulling her hand out, she quietly continued, "To say that the world has collapsed for me is nothing to say. My childhood dream had shattered, and it seemed to me that I would never be able to trust anyone again. So I decided to get as far away from it all as I could. And after telling my mom that I was going to college, I went into town. I really tried to do it, but quickly realized that such a redneck and penniless is not so easy to do it. I failed my first exam, and having decided to stay in town, I started looking for a job. With difficulty, I found a small room in a communal apartment on the outskirts of town, which I could rent. When my mother sent me to the city, she gave me all of her stash, which was enough for a couple of months of renting this miserable apartment, and even a little for food. But realizing that I wouldn't live on those pennies, I wandered around town from morning till night looking for work. John thought there was more sadness in her eyes at that moment. It was as if she was transported mentally back in time. Suddenly, interrupting her story, she asked, "I'm probably distracting you from something important, aren't I? You're totally interested in all this, aren't you? But the way you looked at me at the wedding, for some reason I felt a terrible urge to tell you everything. And to be honest, I have no one to talk to." The young man, as if afraid she would interrupt her story, quickly replied, "No, Anna. I'm willing to listen as much as you want to talk. What happened next? Did you find a job?" At this point, he wasn't lying. He really wanted to listen and listen to her. He realized that this conversation was very important to her, too. Everywhere I went looking for work, I got rejected. It was understandable. Who would want such an employee with no education or experience? At one point, I was so desperate that I was ready to go as a cleaner or even a janitor. But another employer just grinned and called me a runaway and said that, as I did not even lift a broom. Eventually, a kind director hired me as a janitor in a supermarket. The work was hard and they paid nothing, but I had no choice. Almost all the money went to pay for my room. My charitable boss often gave me some products that were nearing the end of their useful life. That's how I survived. John looked at her, and his heart clenched in his chest. He wanted to hug her, protect her, take care of her, and never let her go again. The young man asked timidly, "How did you end up in the village again?" "By the way, let's call me you." Gladly, she replied. "Come on." "Oh, come on." It took me a while to get back to the village, although at times it was so hard that I really wanted to do it. No matter how hard it was, my mother was always there at home, and it was only in the city that I understood what a home is. Life with my stepfather seemed petty compared to life with my communal neighbors. There weren't many tenants, but almost all of them were worth each other. Austin, a former sailor, drank as well as my stepfather. But if someone drank as well as my stepfather and went wandering around the village, that Austin would sing songs in the common kitchen, or, worse, put up a fight with our buddies. In a second room lived the husband, wife, and 3 kids. I wondered how they could fit into the 10 square meters of their room. It seemed to me that the silence was only for a couple of hours at night when everyone fell asleep, and the rest of the time there were parents arguing or children sharing toys with shouting. In general, return to this madhouse did not want to. But for my own good fortune, I lived there. I smiled briefly there, as if remembering something very pleasant. She continued, "One day a married couple came into our store. The man, taking the cart, headed into the rows while the woman coaxed and cranky. A toddler about 2 years old walked by. He hummed and didn't want to go. I decided to help by watching from the sidelines. I've always loved messing with the little ones. And I brought up my brother by myself since he was a baby. My mom didn't have time to take care of us. It's easy to calm a little boy down. I suggested that his mother watch him while she and her husband went shopping. He immediately came to me in my arms and quickly calmed down. When my parents wanted to take Steve, the boy's name, away from the cash register, he wrapped his arms around my neck and refused to come down. With difficulty, I persuaded him, promising to be sure to come back again. They took their son and left. The next day, the man came back and offered me a job with them. He said they lived in the countryside in a nice house and had a separate guest house, which they offered me. From that day on, my fate changed completely. I lived in the beautiful detached house all day long, from early morning until late at night, being with Steve. The boy turned out to be a beautiful and well-behaved little boy. I was fed and given a salary, some of which I was able to send to my mother, begging her not to show the money to my stepfather. The boy's parents worked hard. The father, as it turned out later, was the head of a fee-charging clinic and an excellent surgeon. The boy's mother, Diana, also worked there as a chief accountant. I wondered then why they hired me so easily, without any references or background checks. One day Diana told me that her husband had a very good sense of people. I worked happily for a year and a half looking after Steve. He became like family to me. But then one day, a terrible thing happened. Anna was silent and sat there unmoving, staring into the distance. John knew at that moment that something irreparable had happened, but he was afraid to speak. He waited for Anna to continue on her own. Steve's parents had invited some friends to the anniversary party, and they went to the other side of town, where the birthday boy lived in the area. I, as always, stayed with the baby, and we spent the whole day walking and drawing with him. In general, we spent the time as usual. At the appointed time, I fed him, put him to bed, and waited for the owner's return. They did not return that evening and did not even call. It wasn't like them at all. Diane called 10 times to ask how Steve was, and then not a single call all evening. Turns out they'd been in a terrible accident on the way home. They were hit by an oncoming gazelle with a tired driver. As soon as she regained consciousness, she asked the nurse to call me and asked me to come over. I left Steve with a neighbor of Diane's friend and immediately went to the hospital. There, the landlady, barely speaking, started begging me not to abandon my son and begged me to take him in after they died. It was as if she had been waiting for me, and having said that almost immediately, she closed her eyes and died quietly. I don't remember how I got home then. I cried all the way home, not knowing what to do and how to live. But I had already decided that I would never leave Steve. Anna was silent again, and John saw the tears running down the girl's cheeks, one by one, without stopping. How unhappy and beautiful she was at the same time. He took her hand in his and put it to his lips. Anna looked at him gratefully and, taking a handkerchief from her purse, wiped her tears. After a little silence, she continued, I don't remember how I got to the cottage village, but my Steve's smiling face brought me back to life. I knew that Diana and her husband were orphans. She had no relatives but Steve, so I had to think of something about the funeral. But the first night the phone rang and a nice male voice, expressing his condolences, said he was a very good friend of Dexter, Steve's father, and would take care of everything. I had never seen this benefactor, but he really arranged everything as it should be. I didn't touch anything, and the funeral went according to all the rules. I was scared that Steve could be taken away to an orphanage at any moment. I knew I had to do something, but where to start, I didn't know. In addition, some Albert began to call, supposedly looking after the financial situation of the deceased family, and began to tell me that they had a lot of debts. He frightened me that the house and all the property belonging to them would be confiscated after a certain legal time. I really got scared. I then remembered what Diane had said in her lifetime about her friend, the same neighbor where I had left Steve, a very powerful husband. I went to them and begged them tearfully to help me adopt Steve, and they surprisingly didn't say no. They did. It wasn't so quick and easy, though. But once I got foster care, I took Steve and went straight home to the country. At that point, I had nowhere else to go, so I decided to go back. I was well aware that no one was waiting for me there, and the joy of my arrival, and even with the baby, will not cause anyone. She stopped the story, looked at John, and asked, Aren't you tired of listening to me talk? Can we stop there? You know so much about me now. First person I tell it to. He, squeezing her palm tightly, replied, No, what are you? I'm ready to listen to you, and I want to know everything about you. What happened to you next? And what about the baby? He's sick. Anna, gently releasing her hands, placed them in her lap and quietly continued. You have no idea how I was greeted at home. Dustin, my brother, had by then enrolled in a technical school in the district center and was living in a dormitory there. Mom had aged a lot in such a short time. She continued to work days and days on the farm. They say Dustin's stipend is small, so he helps out. Stepdad still drank. Only they wouldn't even take him to work anymore. So he took what he could out of the house. By that time, The bastard had sold the TV, the iron, and everything else he could sell. He lived off my mother himself. Every chance he got, he told me that Steve and I were freeloaders and freeloaders. My ex-boyfriend showed up when he heard from someone that I had returned from the city, and even with someone else's child, and gloated about it for a long time. He said, "That's right, if no one needs you anymore, then at least raise someone else's child." These were the most hurtful words to me. I threw him out and asked him never to come back. John could see how hard this memory was for her. And seeing an ice cream stand appear in the park, he suddenly asked, "What kind of ice cream do you like?" The girl turned around at him in bewilderment and timidly replied, "I've never tasted anything but plain ice cream, although once I saw a little girl eating something on a stick covered with chocolate, and I wanted it so much, but I didn't have any money at the time. But I always wanted to try it." John smiled and quickly, getting up, went somewhere. A couple of minutes later, he returned with a whole bag of popsicles in various flavors. "Here," he said, handing the treat to the girl. "Try them all. Dreams must come true." Anna looked at John confusedly in the bag. "Take it quickly and taste it," the young man said. "All for you." Anna took out the first popsicle she could find and carefully unwrapped it and took a bite. The girl closed her eyes as if trying to get the most out of her treat. After waiting for her to eat the popsicle appetizingly, he asked, "Well, was it possible to live on the income from the sale of the brooms?" That money probably wasn't enough to buy bread either. "What do you mean?" "Stop eating ice cream," she replied. "I didn't just sell brooms. Got a job on a farm. Took turns taking shifts with my mom." "Yeah," looked after Steve. Did a little bit of work. Mama loved Steve. It's impossible not to love him. Life wasn't easy, of course, but it was bearable. One day Steve was walking in the yard and, climbing on a homemade swing, he went off the top. Broke a leg. My mother and I were both home that night, and we rushed to him and knew right away that it was very serious. The ambulance could be years away, so my mom rushed to her neighbor, who was a part-time cabbie, and laid out all the money she had. Asked him to take Steve to the county hospital. John saw the ice cream set aside, slowly turning to liquid, dripping to the ground, but was afraid to interrupt, and the girl continued, "You can't imagine what we've been through. Taking turns with my mom going to work and going back to the hospital to see Steve again. They discharged him after a month, but he's still limping. He needs some kind of correction, which costs a lot of money. Where do we get these from? I already went through all the stations. Kind people told me that I could get an operation on a quota. But in response to all my appeals, they just put me on a waiting list. But I have the feeling that the line goes backwards." The operation was postponed farther and farther away, citing the fact that the first are some welfare recipients. It is unclear where they come from. I began to save money. I put aside literally every kopeck. So I started knitting brooms in my spare time. My stepfather, as soon as he felt the profit, went through my room every night among my things. But it is clear that he hid the money in the co-ops. I was sure he wouldn't go there. I knew with my mind that the sum of money for the surgery was beyond our family's means. But hope remained in my heart. I said quietly, "This is delicious. Thank you. I've never tasted anything like this in my life." John, smiling, took a new portion out of the bag, but he suddenly laughed and said, "Come on, I already ate another one." It was Steve who ate, as he says, 100 of them. As if making excuses, she continued, "I tried to earn as much as I could, from early in the morning on the farm. Then I'd go into the woods and knit brooms and take them out to the track. It wasn't 1 million, of course, but every penny was precious to us. When a motorcade of 5 expensive cars drove by, they stopped at my brooms. I was completely confused. A handsome man who came out of one of them first threw $100 in the basket, then looking at me suddenly asked me to marry him. The man was a little drunk. I thought it was a rich man's way of having fun. I thought he was joking. But he left without getting a response from me, and the next morning he came back and asked me to marry him in all seriousness. When he found out that I had a child and that he was sick, he began to press on it, assuring me that he would do everything to cure Steve. When he came back a week later, I agreed again. I really needed the money, or someone to pay for Steve's treatment. Looking at John as if apologizing, she added, "Well, people live without love." So I decided I would live with a man out of gratitude if he would help my son. That's how I ended up in your city. The boy's heart ached with pity for Anna. He was in shock. How much had this frail little girl endured? They sat on the bench for a while. Then John suggested a walk, and they walked through the alleys of the park. He did not want to part, but time ruthlessly flew by, and soon Anna apologized and said that she had to go back to her husband. Not amused by the childish blush, she added, "Not missing. Please call me, at least sometimes. I have no one in this town. I don't even have anyone to talk to." Several times after that meeting, John called, and they, while the banker was out of the house, could talk for an hour about everything. He was ready to listen to her voice all day long, but once a jealous hubby caught her with a phone in his hands and made a grand scandal. He yelled so much that John already wanted to come to rescue Anna, but she forbade it, saying, "Don't, we'll take care of it," saying, "Don't, we'll take care of it." She said later that her husband began to check on her, showing up at odd hours, and he could go out so that he did not even come home at night. John's friends said that a couple of times they saw the ladies' man in the clubs with young, long-legged girls, having fun. One day, in the middle of the night, John got a call from Anna. The girl cried into the tube and begged, "John, I beg you, come here. You have no idea what I found at my husband's." "He's a scoundrel, what light hasn't seen." Without thinking twice, John grabbed his car keys, and within 20 minutes, he was across town at the house where the girl lived. To his surprise, the door was open, and only when he entered the spacious hallway, he saw Anna lying on the floor with a bloody head. John rushed to her and, falling to his knees, began to feel for her pulse. When he saw a heavy vase with bloodstains lying nearby, he involuntarily picked it up. At that moment, he heard drunken laughter behind him. Turning around, he saw the smirking face of the banker, who hissed angrily, "Well, my little dove, I got you, didn't I? Now you're going to answer for it." John, with a scream and burst out of his heart, lunged at the scoundrel. "I'll kill you, you bastard," shouted the lad. "What did you do her for?" He swung. But no sooner had he struck than someone intercepted his arm. It turned out the owner had thought of everything and had already called the police. As the policemen were tightening the handcuffs, the banker said snidely, "It's not me, it's you. For what came in your mistress, my wife?" John was prosecuted and put behind bars. His mother and father fought hysterically, and using all their connections, tried to get him out. But the rich man's connections and money were much greater, and he made sure that the boy was put in the same cell with the most dangerous thugs and repeat offenders. John had to endure abuse. The criminals bullied him, tried to strangle him, beat him in the middle of the night, and one of them constantly hinted angrily that they would all be using him. In the worst sense of the word. At some point, John didn't want to live. He was ready to go for the noose himself, and only the thought of Anna made him endure the abuse and hope for her recovery. By that time, he knew from his lawyer that the girl was in a coma, and there had been no improvement so far. Steve, to his surprise, was taken in by Anna's mother, and the same lawyer reported that the drunken stepfather was hit by a car and died. He turned out to be a real professional, and a couple of days later, John was released on his own. First place the guy rushed to was the hospital, one of the rooms where Anna lay. He managed to get himself admitted to her, and he was on duty at her bedside 24 hours a day, begging her to regain consciousness as soon as possible. "Darling, my darling," John whispered, holding back tears and kissing her hand. "Come back, I really need you. I'll never leave you now, and I won't let anyone hurt you. Wake up, please. His prayers seemed to be answered. And one morning, as he slept with his head on the bed with his beloved, someone gently stroked him on the head. He literally jumped up in his chair. He couldn't believe the sad, but so beloved eyes were looking at him. And faintly she said, "How sweet you are when you sleep." From that day on, she was on the mend quickly. And the first thing she told me was what she had cried for that ill-fated night and asked John to come over. He hadn't been home that night. He had gone somewhere else that night, and then he came back again. Quickly he went to the office, where there was a safe with all his savings in it. Then he took something and left again without saying a word. And I noticed that he had forgotten to turn out the lights. I went into the study. He didn't usually let me in there. It was his holy of holies. He could sit there for hours, making some calls, rummaging through papers, and pulling up expensive alcohol. But that night, I decided that turning off the lights was not a crime, and I stepped over the threshold. Almost immediately, my gaze was drawn to the ajar door of a huge safe. At that moment, my curiosity got the better of me, and looking around as if someone could see me, I approached it. On the top shelf was a pile of papers. The bottom had another door with a code lock that was tightly closed. 5 in the foyer. I realized that the contents of the lower part would remain unknown to me, so I decided to see what kind of papers were upstairs. John saw that it was still hard to talk. Though curiosity was getting the better of him, he did say, "Honey, maybe you shouldn't worry and talk just yet. You're still too weak." To which Anna took a sip of water from the glass held out by John. Quietly, she said, "No, John, I want you to know everything and help me punish this scoundrel. You have no idea what I found in there. Remember I told you that after his parents died, Steve got a phone call from a gentleman who said he was their financial clerk. He was threatening him with bankruptcy at the time, talking about Dexter and Diane's crazy debts. He also told me that Steve and I would have to leave the house because everything had been confiscated for debt. This creep wasn't even embarrassed that Steve was left without his parents' inheritance at home, that he was forced to live in our old dilapidated cottage in the country, while his parents' legal home, as a result of the machinations of my now husband, went to this scoundrel. In the safe was stock and some other papers in Steve's parents' names. I am not versed in these documents, but the paper lying there must have been fake, written in my husband's name, in Dexter's name. I would never believe that my parents, after waiting so long for an heir, would just sign everything over to someone else's uncle. Then I called you and didn't even hear the creep come back. As I hung up the phone, I managed to see a raised hand flicker over me from the vase. And the next thing I knew, it was dark. That same day, a police officer arrived right in her room. Anna told me the details once again on the tape recorder. She was not strong enough to write, and it would take a long time to describe what had happened. A criminal case was opened against the banker. There was no problem paying him off with his money, and the case was closed before it could be opened. But the fame of the scoundrel's sordid deeds quickly spread far beyond the city limits. The suspended sentence he was given put a certain imprint on his business, and it was said that many of the companions refused to work with him. The scoundrel's reputation was badly damaged, and all the property that belonged to Steve's parents returned to the boy. Since Anna was the kid's legal guardian, Anna was able to pay for the operation, and before long the boy was happily running in the yard of the house and kicking a ball, shouting, "John, are you the goalie today?" After the boy underwent surgery, John, coming to check on them at the hospital, took Anna's hand and, looking straight into her eyes, asked, "Will you marry me? I love you very much, and I want to always be there for you and Steve." Anna smiled unconcerned and said quietly, "But I'm not even divorced yet." "Well, if that's all that's stopping you," said the same guy, "then you'll be divorced very quickly. And I'm ready to sign Anna the same day." "I agree. Of course I agree. And I love you very much, too." After being discharged from the hospital, John took Anna and Steve back to his apartment. And as soon as they arrived, he told them that his parents were very anxious to meet him and promised to stop by tonight. Anna looked at him frightened and said timidly, "John, I'm scared." "What if they don't like me? They are so rich, aren't they? And what am I? I'm just a country girl." John laughed and, picking her up like Pushkin, whirled around the apartment. "What kind of redneck are you? You're beautiful, smart, the mother of a beautiful little boy and my favorite. And my parents are simple, kind people like me." The father and mother came in the evening and immediately found common ground with Steve and Anna. And in half an hour, John's mother was whispering with the girl in the kitchen, and his father was teaching Steve how to play chess, saying, "Come on, grandson, let's learn. It's a very good game for the brain. John, do you know how to play it?" The evening was very warm and cordial. They parted as close friends. At that time, John told them that he was going to marry Anna and adopt Steve. His parents looked at each other, and his father said good-naturedly, "There you go, mother, and you were worried about no grandchildren. They're ready to give you a grown-up little boy. So get used to being a grandmother." The little boy looked at both of them seriously and maturely stated, "Well, if she's a grandma, then you're a grandpa. Grandma has to be with Grandpa all the time." Everyone laughed and went to see their parents off. That evening, after putting Steve to bed, she and John sat cuddled on the couch for a long time, unable to believe that they would always be together now. Anna was divorced very quickly, even without the presence of his wife, and they filed for divorce on the same day. With John, they decided not to have a big party, no matter how much they insisted on it. The parents simply booked a cozy restaurant near the house and invited the closest people. On the day of the wedding, you decorated with fresh flowers. The newlyweds were greeted in the hall by John's parents and Anna's mother, who had come from the village, supported under the arm of the girl's smiling brother. Of course, they asked for it. John's friends, upon learning that he was getting married, the boys showed up with cake and champagne right at his house and began to resent him from the doorstep. "What do you call that? He means he's such a hero. He stole the Bluebeard's wife, and he's gonna marry her." And not a word to his friends. "Alexander, as always," continued Kevin's thought. "If your mother hadn't told mine, we wouldn't have known. But now you are not confused from us. We must be present at this celebration." John did not try to justify that they did not want to make a fuss and make a big party, but the friends insisted. On the wedding day, Kevin and Alexander brought a huge basket of flowers, and every 5 minutes they were happily throttling their throats, raising their shot glasses over their heads bitterly. The most handsome and joyful guest at this celebration was Steve in a bow-tie suit. He looked like a real gentleman and had been spilling out in the center of the room, taking turns pulling guests from behind the table, almost limping all evening. John looked at his parents in the park like lovebirds and whispered quietly to his wife, "I haven't seen them this happy in a long time, and Steve stubbornly won't let go of my hands." She put her palm on her spouse's palm and answered in the same whisper, "It's as if my mother has grown younger. I haven't seen her in a long time. So beautiful with her hair in a dress. She used to go to the farm in working clothes and a headscarf. And here she is so beautiful." The woman was indeed unrecognizable. Her neatly styled curls and smart dress in purple, which suited her very well, made her look younger and fresher. Despite the small number of people invited, the evening was fun and very warm in a family way. Almost immediately after the wedding, John, learning of her love of mathematics, insisted that she attend a preparatory course. And the very next year, she easily entered the Pedagogical Institute. John, on the other hand, after graduation, took a job with his father, which really pleased him. He had long dreamed of transferring the business to his son and himself, as he said, to take care of the dacha and the grandchildren. They now went to the country almost every weekend, and sometimes the newfound grandmothers would go there for a whole week and take Steve with them. Anna's mother and John's mother became very good friends. They often called each other and met. On one such trip, John, smiling enigmatically, asked his parents to sit down and, taking Anna's hand, said, "Dearly beloved family, my granddaughter and I have to let you know that we've made sure what wonderful grandparents you are. We haven't let you down. And we have decided to give you another granddaughter. We will have a daughter." There was silence for a minute, and then something unimaginable began. The mothers hugged each other and wiped away their tears of joy, and the father poured a shot of cognac, drank it in one gulp, and started shaking hands with his son and kissing his daughter-in-law again. And Steve began to run around shouting with joy, "I'm going to have a baby sister." Anna and John stood hugging and laughing happily as they watched all that was going on. If you like the story, please support me with a thumbs up button. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. I wish you all the best. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.